Welcome to your deep dive into UI design. We're going to unpack some really insightful tips and tricks from Refactoring UI by Adam Wathan and Steve Schoger. I think you'll find their approach really refreshing.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting how they kind of challenge that urge to, start a design by laying everything out perfectly from the get-go.
Yeah, right. I'm so guilty of that. But they advocate for this feature-first approach, which it's almost like building a house room by room instead of like starting with the whole blueprint.
You could say that. Think of it like this. An app is basically a collection of features. So it kind of makes sense to like nail down the design of those individual pieces first before you try to, fit them into a larger shell, right?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
almost like that famous quote, start with the why. But here, it's more like start with the what. Like, what do we actually want this app to do, right?
Exactly. And they use a great example. It's designing a flight booking feature, but just the bare bones.
Yeah.
Departure city, destination, dates, and that search button.
It's really simple.
And that's the point. And that's kind of how Google began too, right? Just that search bar and a go button.
Totally. It's almost like giving yourself those early constraints helps you prioritize what's truly essential.
Exactly.
And speaking of constraints, the book also makes this surprising argument for starting your designs in low fidelity.
Ditch those fancy design tools now. Think Sharpie sketches.
Really?
Yeah, wireframes, but wireframes in grayscale.
Hmm. At first, I thought that sounded a little limiting, but the more I think about it, it kind of makes sense. Like, it's almost like forcing yourself to think in black and white first. So then when you do add color, it's a deliberate enhancement.
Yeah, it's not a crutch.
Right, exactly. It's about stripping away all those distractions and just focusing on the core hierarchy of your design. When you're limited to those basic tools, you can't rely on, fancy visuals to make things look good.
Right.
You have to make the structure itself communicate clear.
And sometimes that's hard.
Yeah. But you know what? It's kind of freeing in a way, I think. It reminds me of those writing exercises where you're only allowed to use certain words.
Oh.
And like the limitations can actually spark more creativity.
I get that.
And here's another point that really struck me. The authors recommend not designing everything up front.
Yeah. This idea of working in cycles definitely resonated with me too.
Yeah.
So like design one feature, build it, then go back and refine it, based on real world feedback.
Yeah. It's so tempting to try and get everything like perfect on paper before you even start coding.
Sure.
But I think they have a point. You can never really anticipate every user behavior or like edge case when you're in the abstract.
It's just impossible.
Right. So I love how they call this the pessimist approach. It's
Right.
like designing with this healthy dose of skepticism. Like you're assuming some things are going to be harder to build than you initially think. So you focus on getting the smallest useful version out there.
Yeah. It's like embracing the idea that you're going to be wrong about some things.
Exactly.
And that's okay.
And that's totally okay, right? You learn from those mistakes and then iterate.
Totally.
Okay. Let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about personality.
Sure.
How do you infuse a design with a distinct vibe?
This is where things get fun, right?
Yeah.
The book points out that every design has a personality, whether you're intentional about it or not.
Yeah.
And so much of that comes down to like font choices, color psychology, even like something as subtle as border radius.
Wait, border radius? Really?
Yeah. Think about it. Like sharp corners can feel very formal and structured,
Mm-hmm.
right? Whereas like rounded corners, they have a softer, more playful feel. It's subtle, but it contributes to the overall impression.
Okay.
And then, of course, there's color, right?
Right. Well, everyone knows blue is supposed to be calming and trustworthy, right? I mean, is that why all the banks use it?
Well, it's more nuanced than that, right? Like colors evoke emotional responses,
Yeah.
and those responses can be influenced by, cultural context too. But the point is, you should be aware of those associations and use color deliberately to, reinforce the mood that you're trying to create.
It makes sense. And font choice is huge, too. I remember redesigning my portfolio a while back, and just swapping out the font made the whole thing feel completely different. It was crazy how much impact it had.
For sure. A serif font can evoke elegance and tradition,
Yeah.
while a sans serif might feel more modern and clean.
Right.
And even within those categories, there's a huge range of personality. Think about like a playful, rounded sans serif versus like a very geometric, almost like brutalist sans serif. They're both sans serif, but they convey very different vibes.
That's true.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got fonts, colors, border radius. What else? What else goes into shaping that personality?
Don't forget about the words, right?
The word.
Yeah, the actual words you use in your UI, the
Yeah.
tone of voice, the microcopy, it all plays a role. Like a formal buttoned-up tone might be appropriate for, a banking site,
Right.
but a more like casual, even playful voice that could work better for, a social media app. It's all about aligning your language with the, overall personality you're trying to project.
Oh my gosh, this is giving me so much to think about for my next project. It's like all these little details that I never really considered before are suddenly becoming really important.
I know. And it can feel overwhelming, but the book makes a really compelling case for actually limiting your design choices.
Wait, what? Limiting.
Yeah, which I know sounds counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, it does.
But they argue that constraints can actually be your best friend.
Hmm. See, my first instinct is always to like keep all my options open,
I get that.
But I can see how that can lead to like decision paralysis, like
Yeah.
spending hours tweaking a button size by like a few pixels.
It's so easy to get caught up in those details,
It is.
It's decision fatigue for designers. And when you don't have a clear system in place, it's easy to end up with an inconsistent design.
Oh, yeah.
One button is this size, another one's that size, and the colors are all over the place. It just feels messy.
It does. So, their solution is to create these like predefined systems for things like font sizes, color palettes, spacing increments. It's like setting up the rules of the game before you start playing.
Exactly. And it might seem restrictive at first,
Yeah.
but having those constraints in place actually frees you up to focus on the bigger picture.
Makes sense.
And they offer this really clever technique for making decisions within those constraints.
Hmm.
It's called designing by process of elimination.
Designing by process of elimination.
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. That sounds intriguing.
Okay, so let's say you're trying to choose an icon size. Okay, you've got your predefined system. Let's say it's 12 pixels, 16 pixels, 24 pixels, and 32 pixels.
Okay.
You start by trying out one size. Okay, then you compare it to the sizes on either side. Most likely, two of those options will be obviously wrong.
Yeah, like either way too big or way too small. So that narrows it down. I like it.
Right, and it forces you to make a choice without getting bogged down in endless tweaking. Now, another key concept from the book is this idea of visual hierarchy. Right, it's not enough to just like throw elements on a page. You have to guide the user's attention.
Right, right. This is where we get into like not all elements are created equal territory, right? But their point about sizes and everything, that really stood out to me.
Yeah, it's so tempting to just think bigger equals more important.
Right. But you don't want to end up with like these giant headlines and, teeny tiny body text just to create contrast. It's about finding other ways to emphasize what matters most.
Right, yeah. They're big on using like font weight and color strategically.
Right.
Like a bold headline doesn't have to be, massive to stand out. And you can use like a softer color for supporting text instead of just shrinking it down to an unreadable size.
Exactly.
It's about finding that balance between like visual clarity and emphasis. And they make this kind of a surprising point about gray text on colored backgrounds. Avoid it.
Yeah.
Really? Why? I feel like it's a pretty common design choice,
No. The problem is that gray text on a color background often it often lacks contrast.
Okay.
And it can look washed out, especially on top of images or patterns. So what they recommend is to actually like handpick a color that has the same hue as the background,
Okay.
but adjust the saturation and lightness to create sufficient contrast. So you're still using a color that like harmonizes with the background.
Right.
It's just slightly adjusted to make sure the text pops.
Exactly.
That's a clever little trick. I'm adding that to my mental design toolbox.
Yeah, it's a good one. Another interesting concept they talk about is emphasizing by de-emphasizing.
What?
Yeah. Sometimes the problem isn't that the main element isn't strong enough. It's that the things around it are they're competing for attention.
Oh, I've totally run into that problem before. Like when you have like a navigation menu and you want to make the active items stand out,
Right.
but you've already like made all the items fairly prominent.
Exactly. So instead of trying to make that active item like even bolder, they suggest making the inactive items less prominent.
Interesting.
So you're basically creating visual breathing room around the element that you want to emphasize.
Yeah, yeah. It's like when you're taking a photo and you want the subject to stand out, sometimes you have to blur the background a little bit.
Right.
You're not making the subject any sharper, but you're just making the background less distracting.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
And this principle can be applied to all sorts of, design elements. Like if
Yeah.
a sidebar is, fighting for attention with the main content, try removing its background color to make it, recede a bit.
Right.
It's all about, creating that visual hierarchy
Yeah.
by subtly shifting the emphasis.
Okay. Now, I know our listeners are probably very passionate about accessibility. So when the book started talking about labels, I was a little bit wary.
I hear you. Put those accessibility pitchforks down. This isn't about form labels. It's about labels that are used when presenting data to the user,
Okay.
like like in a profile view or a dashboard, right?
Okay, I see. So it's more about information design, not accessibility in that like technical sense.
Exactly. And the book makes this really interesting point that labels should be a last resort.
Really?
Yeah, often like the format or the context of the data is it's enough to make it clear what it represents. Like an email address has a very recognizable structure,
Right.
and we don't need a label to tell us that it's an email address.
It's true. It's almost like those labels become visual clutter when they're not truly necessary.
Exactly. And even when a label is necessary, the authors advise, treating it as like supporting content.
Okay.
Make it smaller, less prominent, and let the data itself be the star of the show.
Right. It's like giving the data its own little spotlight.
Exactly.
But wait, isn't there a rule about always labeling form fields for accessibility?
Yes.
Okay, I'm getting a bit confused now.
No, don't worry. We're not contradicting those those accessibility guidelines.
Okay.
Like form labels are absolutely essential for screen readers and users with cognitive disabilities.
Mhm.
This is a separate discussion about how to present data in a clear and visually appealing way.
Okay, phew. I'm glad we cleared that up.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how a lot of these principles are interconnected. It's like you can't think about one aspect of design without considering its impact on everything else.
Absolutely.
And another interesting point they make is about separating visual hierarchy from document hierarchy. Those heading tags like H1, H2, and so on.
Right.
Oh yeah, I am totally guilty of just like using H1 for the main heading, H2 for subheadings, and so on, without really thinking about how they're actually going to look on the page.
It's easy to fall into that trap.
Yeah.
The problem is that those default font sizes can create this really unbalanced hierarchy.
Okay.
You end up with these giant section titles that they just steal attention from the actual content.
Right. Yeah. It's like the title of a chapter shouldn't be louder than the chapter itself.
Exactly. So what they recommend is to think about section titles more like labels.
Okay.
They provide context, they provide structure, but they don't need to dominate the page visually. You might even end up using like an H3 tag for a visually prominent headline, depending on the context.
It's like choosing the right tool for the job, not just following the default settings. And I'm starting to notice a pattern here. They seem to really advocate for breaking those like ingrained design habits and thinking more critically about every choice you make.
Absolutely. It's about moving beyond those default assumptions and finding what works best for your specific design.
Right. So, speaking of breaking assumptions, let's dive into their approach to layout and spacing, because I've always struggled with finding that sweet spot between too cluttered and too much white space.
I hear you. You know what's interesting? They actually recommend starting with too much white space.
Wait, seriously?
Yeah.
But everyone always says white space is wasted space. Like you got to fit as much content on the screen as possible.
I know that's the traditional way of thinking, but they argue that that starting with like ample breathing room and then removing it as needed leads to more elegant and balanced designs.
It's like giving every element the space it deserves to shine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while dense UIs certainly have their place, it's important to to make that a deliberate choice, not the default.
Right. And another crucial aspect of layout is establishing a spacing and sizing system.
Yeah.
Because who wants to spend hours agonizing over whether a button should be like 120 pixels or 125 pixels wide.
No.
Right. It's like those tiny decisions can just drive you crazy. But how do you create a system that actually like makes sense?
They recommend um, they recommend using a scale based on multiples and factors of a base value.
Hmm.
So let's say your base value is 16 pixels. You might have increments of 8 pixels, 16 pixels, 24 pixels, 32 pixels, and so on.
So it's all like it's all based on a consistent mathematical progression.
Huh.
I'm starting to feel like my brain is doing math, which is always a good sign, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the beauty of the system is that it takes the guesswork out of those micro decisions.
Right.
Instead of tweaking things pixel by pixel, you just grab the next value in your scale and see if it works.
Yeah. It's like giving yourself a set of like pre-approved building blocks makes the
Yeah.
whole process a lot more efficient.
Exactly. And speaking of efficiency, let's talk about a common layout pitfall. It's that feeling that you have to like fill the entire screen.
Oh yeah.
Just because you have a wide canvas, it doesn't mean you have to cram content into every corner.
Oh my gosh, I'm so guilty of this. Like I always feel this pressure to make everything full width, even if it doesn't really make sense.
Right. So they suggest thinking in columns instead.
Okay.
If you have a section that that works best at a narrower width, try splitting it into two columns instead of like stretching it out to fill the entire screen.
Right. So you're still using all the available space, but you're doing it in a way that feels more balanced and visually appealing.
Exactly. And this applies to components too.
Yeah, okay.
Don't use relative sizing unless you actually want an element to scale proportionally. Like if a button looks best at 500 pixels wide, there's no reason to like make it shrink on larger screens just because you're adhering to like a grid system or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah, it's like give that button the space it needs to breathe, you know?
Yeah.
Don't force it to conform if it doesn't need to.
And they bring up another interesting point about relative sizing. Like we often assume that that defining things in relation to other elements will ensure that they always scale proportionally.
Right, right.
But that's not necessarily true.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like if you define a headline as 2.5 times the size of the body text using M's, that relationship might look great at like a large font size, but
Right.
it could be way out of proportion at like a smaller size.
Exactly. So it's important to be mindful of how those relative relationships behave at different screen sizes, right?
Right.
And be willing to adjust them as needed. You want to maintain visual harmony across the board.
Hmm. This is really challenging some of my ingrained design habits, I've always been a big fan of M's, but now I'm realizing that they're not always the best solution.
I know, right? It's about choosing the right tool for the job. And sometimes like pixels or rems are a better option for ensuring consistent sizing. Now, another crucial aspect of layout is spacing.
Okay.
And one of the key principles they highlight is the importance of avoiding ambiguous spacing.
Okay, help me out here. What exactly does ambiguous spacing mean?
It's about making it clear which elements belong together, and preventing users from misinterpreting the relationships between those elements.
So it's all about visual clarity and grouping.
Exactly. A common example is a form with stacked labels and inputs.
Okay.
If the spacing between each label input pair is the same as the spacing between groups, it can create confusion.
Right. Yeah. It's hard to tell where one group ends and the next one begins.
Exactly. So the solution is to increase the spacing between groups.
Okay.
So there's a clear visual separation.
It's almost like adding a little visual pause between those groups to give the user's eye a chance to kind of like reset.
Right.
And this applies to other elements too, right?
Yeah.
Like sections in an article or items in a list.
Absolutely. Think about a heading in an article, right?
Okay.
If there's not enough space above the heading, it can kind of visually merge with the previous paragraph.
Right.
And that makes it hard to scan,
Yeah.
Or, in a bulleted list, if the spacing between bullets is the same as the line height, it can be tricky to tell where one bullet ends and the next one begins.
Yeah, yeah. So the key takeaway here is to make sure there's more space around groups than within them. This is making me want to go back and audit all my old designs and see where I've been messing up with spacing.
I know. It's one of those things you don't really notice until you start paying attention to it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now, let's shift gears and talk about typography, which is one of those fundamental aspects of design that can really like make or break a UI.
Oh yeah. I've always struggled with typography. It feels so subjective and overwhelming. Like where do you even begin?
Well, they make a great point about starting with a type scale. It's basically a predefined set of font sizes that you'll use throughout your UI rather than choosing arbitrary values every time you need to like set a font size.
So it's like creating like a little font size menu for yourself.
Yeah.
But how do you decide what sizes to include?
They recommend a handcrafted scale that provides a good range of options without being overwhelming. And the key is to use smaller increments at the bottom of the scale, where you're dealing with smaller text sizes, and larger increments at the top for headlines and other large text elements.
This is making me think about musical scales, which probably says more about my musical background than my design skills. But I get the analogy. It's like having a set of intervals that work harmoniously together.
Exactly. And another important point they make is to avoid using M units for defining your type scale,
Okay.
because M's are relative to the parent font size, and so nested elements can end up with font sizes that fall outside of your predefined system.
Right. So you lose that consistency and control that you worked so hard to establish.
Exactly. So stick to pixels or rems to ensure that you're always using the sizes that you've carefully chosen. Now, another key aspect of typography is font selection. And let's be honest, there are a lot of fonts out there.
It's like that scene in Clueless where Cher is trying to choose an outfit.
Uh-huh.
Like ugh, as if
Exactly. But they offer some practical advice for finding high quality fonts, even if you're not a typography expert. Like for UI design, a neutral sans serif font is usually a safe bet.
like Helvetica or Arial, those like classic go-to fonts.
Yeah, those are good examples. Or the system font stack that's built into most browsers.
Oh yeah, yeah. I've heard good things about that. It's supposed to be really good for performance and accessibility, right?
Exactly. And if you're feeling more adventurous, try filtering fonts by the number of styles they offer, like fonts with a wide range of weights and italics. They often indicate a higher level of craftsmanship and attention to detail.
It's like choosing a well-tailored suit. The more options you have, the better the fit.
Exactly. And another tip: don't be afraid to steal from the best.
So from the best.
You take a look at your favorite websites and see what fonts they're using. Like those design teams probably put a lot of thought into their typography choices.
Right, yeah. It's like, why reinvent the wheel when there are already like so many great examples out there.
Exactly.
And speaking of things to steal, I've always been curious about how they decide on line length. Like how long is too long for a line of text?
They actually give a very specific range, 45 to 75 characters per line. That's supposed to be the sweet spot for readability.
Okay. So it's not just about like fitting as much text on a line as possible.
Right.
It's about finding that balance between density and leg.
It's about finding that balance between density and legibility.
Right.
And even if you're working with wider content like images or other elements, you might consider limiting the width of the text paragraphs, even if the overall container is wider.
So it's about creating a more comfortable reading experience, even if you have to like sacrifice a bit of space.
Exactly. Now, another typography detail that I've always struggled with is baseline alignment.
Oh yeah.
When you're mixing font sizes on a single line, it's tempting to just like vertically center everything.
Yeah.
But that can actually create a subtle misalignment of the baselines, especially when when the font size are significantly different. So they recommend aligning the text by its baseline instead.
So you're making sure that the bottom of the letters is all lined up neatly, regardless of the font size. It's
Exactly.
like those elementary school penmanship exercises all over again.
Uh-huh. Exactly. And it creates a much cleaner and more harmonious look. Now, another aspect of typography that's often overlooked is line height.
Oh yeah, this is one of those things that I always just kind of eyeball.
I get that.
Is there a better way to approach it?
They make a great point about how line height shouldn't be fixed.
Okay.
It should actually change based on the font size and the line length.
Wait, really? I've always just used like a standard line height of 1.5 for everything.
Sure,
Yeah.
but for smaller text and longer lines, you actually want a taller line height
Okay.
to improve readability.
So it's about like adding a bit more breathing room between those lines.
Exactly.
And as the text gets larger or the lines get shorter, you can decrease the line height accordingly.
Right. It's all about finding that sweet spot where there's enough space to prevent eye strain, but not so much space that it feels overly airy.
Yeah, yeah. This is blowing my mind a little bit. It's like all these tiny details that I never really thought about before are suddenly becoming like really important.
I know, and it can feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
But they make another interesting point about links.
Okay.
Like we tend to assume that every link needs to be styled the same way,
Yeah.
with a distinct color or underline.
Yeah.
But they argue that that's not always necessary.
Yeah, especially in interfaces where like almost everything is clickable. It can create like visual overload. Like when you hover over a section and like everything lights up,
Right.
it's hard to know where to look.
Right. Exactly. So they suggest using more subtle styling for most links,
Okay.
like a heavier font weight or a slightly darker color.
Right.
And for less important links, you might even forego any special styling by default and only apply it on hover.
It's like giving those links a little bit of breathing room too.
Exactly. Now let's talk about text alignment.
Okay.
This seems like pretty basic concept,
Yeah.
but they offer some interesting insights.
Okay. I've always been taught that left line text is the most readable. Is that still true?
For the most part, yes. But there are exceptions, right? Like
Yeah.
center alignment can work well for headlines or short blocks of text.
Right. Yeah. It gives them a more symmetrical, balanced feel.
Exactly. But avoid using center alignment for longer paragraphs. It can make it harder to track where you left off on the previous line.
Right.
And if you're designing a table with numbers,
Okay.
they recommend right aligning the numbers.
That makes sense. It makes it easier to like scan and compare those numbers.
Exactly. And if you're going for a more formal print-inspired look and you want to use justified text,
Okay.
be sure to enable hyphenation
Okay.
to prevent those awkward, gaps between words.
Okay.
It creates a much more polished and professional appearance.
It does.
Yeah.
Okay, last but not least, let's talk about letter spacing. It's one of those like subtle details that can make a big difference in the overall feel of your typography.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
But I've always been a bit intimidated by it, to be honest. Like, do you really need to adjust the spacing between like individual letters?
The general advice is to, trust the font designer
Okay.
and leave the letter spacing alone.
Right. So it's more about respecting the integrity of the font
Yeah,
and not trying to like over-engineer it.
exactly. But there are a couple of situations where adjusting the letter spacing can improve readability
Okay.
for headlines that are set in a font with wide letter spacing.
Okay.
Tightening the spacing slightly can create a more impactful look.
So it's almost like condensing those letters to give them like more visual weight.
Exactly. And for all caps text,
Okay.
they recommend increasing the letter spacing
Okay.
to improve legibility
Gotcha.
because it provides more visual separation between those letters.
Right. It's almost like giving those capital letters a little bit of breathing room too. We're back to breathing room. It seems to be the recurring theme here.
I think you're onto something. Now, let's move from the world of black and white into the world of color.
Oh, this is my favorite part, but also the most overwhelming. There are just so many colors to choose from.
You and me both.
Yeah.
But the authors of Refactoring UI take a really interesting approach to, uh, color selection.
Oh.
They move beyond just picking colors that, look good together
Right.
and advocate for creating a comprehensive color system.
So it's more strategic and intentional than just like going with your gut feeling.
Exactly. And they dispel a common myth about color palettes.
Okay.
They argue that you actually need more colors than you think.
Yeah, really. I always thought those like 5 color palettes were like the ideal.
I know those are a good starting point,
Yeah.
but they won't give you the versatility you need for a complex UI.
Okay.
So they recommend breaking your color system down into 3 main categories:
Okay.
grays, primary colors, and accent colors.
Okay. And within each category.
You'll need multiple shades. They recommend starting with 8 to 10 shades of gray alone.
Wow. Okay. I've always just used like 3 shades of gray. Light gray for backgrounds, medium gray for text, and dark gray for things like borders.
Sure, but think about all the different states and variations you might need: disabled states, hover states, tooltips, different background colors.
Yeah.
Having a well-defined range of grays,
Yeah.
it prevents you from constantly having to invent new shades on the fly,
Yeah.
which can lead to inconsistencies.
Right. Yeah. So it's like having a ready-made toolbox of grays at your disposal.
Exactly. And then for primary colors, you'll also want multiple shades
Yeah.
to create visual interest and depth. Think about how brands like Facebook use different shades of blue throughout their UI.
Yeah, they've really mastered that blue. It's become synonymous with their brand.
Right. And finally, you want a few accent colors
Right.
to highlight specific elements or convey different states,
Okay.
like warnings or success messages. And each accent color should also have its own set of shades.
So all in all, how many colors are we talking about here?
It's not uncommon to end up with as many as 10 different base colors
Then.
with 5 to 10 shades each
Wow.
for a complex UI.
That's a lot of colors.
Yeah.
I'm starting to understand why those 5 color palettes don't cut it.
I know, right? And another important point they make is to define those shades up front.
Oh.
Instead of using CSS preprocessor functions to generate shades on the fly.
Right.
Take the time to carefully select and define each shade in your your style sheet.
Okay, so I've always relied on SAS to generate my shades. Is there a downside to that?
It can lead to inconsistencies and a muddy color palette. If you're not deliberately choosing each shade, you're not really in control of your color system.
So it's about being more intentional and methodical about your color choices.
Exactly. Now, speaking of being intentional, there's this fascinating relationship between saturation and lightness that they highlight.
Okay.
As a color gets lighter or darker, its saturation appears to decrease.
So like a bright red will look less vibrant as you add more white to it, right? Dan?
Exactly. To maintain the vibrancy of your colors, you actually need to increase the saturation as the lightness moves away from 50%.
That's counterintuitive, but I can see why it's necessary. You're basically compensating for that natural loss of saturation that occurs when you adjust the lightness.
Right. And if you're working with a base color that's already highly saturated, you can play with the hue to achieve lighter or darker shades while maintaining that intensity.
Ooh, I like that. So you're subtly shifting the color itself rather than just its brightness.
Exactly. But we can't talk about color without talking about accessibility, right?
Right, of course not. It's so important to keep accessibility in mind when choosing colors, especially when working with light text on dark backgrounds or colored text on colored backgrounds.
Absolutely. And the Web Content Accessibility
So
Guidelines,
WSA.
WK, they recommend specific contrast ratios for text to ensure readability for users with, visual impairments.
Right. It's one thing to like create a beautiful color palette, but if people can't actually read the text, it's kind of pointless.
Exactly. And, meeting those guidelines can be tricky when you're working with color, especially when dealing with, light text on dark backgrounds
So
or colored text on colored backgrounds.
yeah, those are definitely the trickiest scenarios I've struggled with that before.
They offer some clever techniques for maintaining accessibility without compromising visual appeal
Okay.
for light text on dark backgrounds.
Okay.
They suggest considering flipping the contrast.
What?
Yeah. So instead of light text on dark, use dark text on light.
So it's like a inverting the whole color scheme.
Exactly. And this can actually improve hierarchy
Okay.
and prevent those elements from competing too strongly for attention.
Right. Right.
And what about color text on colored backgrounds?
Yeah, that's the one that always gets me.
I know, right? So they suggest rotating the hue of the text
Okay.
towards a brighter color to increase contrast without without making it too close to white.
Right. So you're still using a color that harmonizes with the background, but you're just shifting it slightly to improve the contrast.
Exactly. It's all about finding those subtle adjustments that can make a big difference in terms of accessibility.
Right.
And another crucial point they make is to never rely on color alone
Oh yeah.
to convey information.
Yeah, I can see how that could be a problem. Like if you're uh using color to indicate different states like success or error messages,
Right.
someone who is colorblind might not be able to differentiate those states.
Exactly. You always want to provide alternative cues
Right.
like icons or text labels to ensure that the information is accessible to everyone. And this is especially important for data visualizations like graphs,
Oh yeah.
where color is often used to distinguish different data series.
Yeah, I've definitely seen graphs where the colors are so similar that it's almost impossible to tell them apart.
Right. So instead of relying on distinct hues,
Okay.
try using varying levels of contrast or patterns.
Mhm.
That way, the data will be clear even without color.
So it's about making sure that the information is conveyed effectively, regardless of the user's visual capabilities.
Exactly. Now, let's move from the world of color
Okay.
into the world of depth.
The world of depth.
Yeah, because even though we're designing for screens,
Right.
we still want to create a sense of depth in our UIs.
Okay. I'm all ears. How do we achieve that depth in a two-dimensional space?
They emphasize a really simple but powerful principle.
Okay.
Light comes from above.
Okay. That seems pretty obvious. But how does that actually translate into design decisions?
It's all about understanding how how light would naturally interact with objects. If you want an element to appear raised,
Okay.
give its top edge a slightly lighter color or a subtle highlight,
Okay.
and add a small dark shadow below it.
So it's like you're mimicking how the light would hit that element if it were a real physical object sitting on a surface.
Exactly.
Okay, I get it. And what about those elements that are inset, like wells or text inputs?
For those, you'd do the opposite.
Okay.
Make the bottom edge lighter and add the shadow above it, as if the light source is casting a shadow into the element.
Right. It's like creating those subtle visual cues that our brains interpret as depth. It's pretty amazing how our brains work.
I know.
It is.
And speaking of creating depth, let's talk about shadows.
Okay.
We tend to think of shadows as purely decorative.
But they can play a much more functional role in UI design.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I've definitely been guilty of just like throwing a shadow on something because it looks cool,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
not really thinking about why I'm doing it.
The key is to understand that shadows can actually convey elevation. Think about it this way. A small, tight shadow
Okay.
will make an element feel slightly raised,
Okay.
while a larger, softer shadow suggests a higher elevation.
So it's like creating a virtual z-axis, almost like we're layering elements in 3D space.
Exactly. And the closer an element feels to the user, the more it will attract their attention.
Right.
So you might use smaller shadows for buttons
Okay.
and larger shadows for modal dialogues, for example.
It's like using their shadows to guide the user's eye through the interface. And speaking of shadows, they have this really cool trick for creating more realistic looking shadows.
Oh yeah, the two-part shadow trick.
Yeah.
It's pretty clever. Instead of using a single box shadow,
Right.
you actually combine two shadows.
Okay.
A larger, softer one to represent the main shadow,
Okay.
and a smaller, tighter one to represent the area directly beneath the element,
Okay.
where ambient light is blocked.
So it's like adding a little bit of extra detail to make those shadows feel more grounded in reality.
Exactly. And the cool thing is, as an element's elevation increases,
Okay.
you can subtly reduce the intensity of that second tighter shadow
Okay.
to mimic how ambient light would behave in the real world.
It's like those little details that really sell the effect. Now, I've always thought of flat design as being, well, flat, but they actually talk about how you can create a sense of depth in flat design too.
Absolutely.
So how do you do that?
It's about it's about being more creative with those depth cues. You don't have to rely on realistic lighting effects to convey depth.
Okay, so what are some of the techniques that they recommend?
One approach is to simply use color.
Hmm.
Lighter elements tend to feel closer,
Okay.
while darker elements recede into the background.
So you're creating that sense of depth through contrast.
Exactly.
And you can also use solid shadows with no blur radius to create a subtle sense of lift without sacrificing that flat aesthetic.
Exactly.
It's like those shadows are just a tiny bit bolder and more graphic.
Right. It's all about finding ways to suggest depth with the constraints of that chosen style.
Mhm.
And another powerful technique for creating depth is overlapping elements.
Overlapping, like literally just putting one element on top of another.
Yeah, it's that simple,
Okay.
but it can be surprisingly effective.
Okay.
It creates the illusion of layers,
Okay.
which adds depth and visual interest.
So it's like we're playing with those layers like in Photoshop.
Right.
Yeah.
This can be as simple as offsetting a card so it extends beyond its container,
Okay.
or making an element taller than its parent,
Okay.
so it overlaps the elements above and below it.
And what about overlapping images? Is that a good idea?
Overlapping images can definitely work, but you have to be careful to prevent them from clashing.
Yeah, I can see how that could get messy quickly.
I know, right? So they recommend adding a subtle invisible border to the images,
Oh.
using the background color to create a little separation between them.
So you're still getting that layered look, but you're preventing those images from bleeding into each other. That's a really clever trick. Okay, let's talk about the images themselves, because
Sure.
they play such a huge role in UI design. What are some of the key insights they share about working with images?
Well, they stress the importance of using good photos,
Okay.
which seems obvious.
Yeah.
But you'd be surprised how many UIs are let down by by bad photography.
Oh yeah, I've definitely seen those websites where the images are all blurry and pixelated,
Yeah.
and it instantly makes the whole site look less professional.
Right. If you're not a skilled photographer yourself,
Yeah.
consider hiring a pro
Okay.
or investing in high quality stock photos.
Yeah.
And what about placing text on top of images?
Oh yeah, that's always a tricky one.
I know.
It is. How do you make sure the text is readable no matter what the image looks like?
The key is to reduce the dynamic range of the image,
Okay.
meaning in creating a more consistent background for your text.
So you're basically trying to even out the brightness levels of the image,
Right.
so you don't have like super bright areas and super dark areas.
Exactly. One approach is to add a semi-transparent overlay,
Okay.
either black or white,
Okay.
to tone down the highlights
Okay.
or lift the shadows.
So it's like adding a subtle filter to the image.
Exactly.
Another technique is to lower the contrast of the image itself,
Yes.
making the brights less bright
Right.
and the darks less dark.
Exactly. You're just compressing the range of tones a bit.
Right.
You can also try colorizing the image with a single color.
Ooh, like a duotone effect.
Yeah, exactly. This can create a more harmonious background
Okay.
and can also help to tie the image more closely to your brand colors. And if if you want to preserve more of the image's original detail, you can try adding a subtle text shadow to the text.
So it's like it's like giving the text a little bit of a halo to help it stand out.
Right. It's all about finding the right technique for the for the specific image and the overall design aesthetic. And speaking of techniques, let's talk about scaling images
Oh yeah.
because it's not as straightforward as it might seem.
Yeah, I've definitely run into problems with scaling images before. Like when you try to make a small image bigger and it ends up all pixelated and blurry.
That's the classic problem with scaling bitmap images up.
Yeah.
But there are other things to be aware of, even when working with vector images.
Wait, vectors can be a problem too?
Well, they're generally better for scaling.
Yeah.
But they're not foolproof.
Right.
For example, scaling small icons up to larger sizes
Okay.
often results in this kind of a chunky, unprofessional look. Those icons were they were designed to be used at a specific size,
Right.
and their level of detail might not translate. Their level of detail might not translate well to larger dimensions.
So it's like trying to stretch a small sweater to fit a larger person.
Right.
It might technically work, but it's not gonna look very good.
Well, that's a great analogy. If you need to use a small icon at a larger size, try enclosing it within a shape, and giving the shape a background color.
Okay.
That way you can maintain the icon's intended size while filling the necessary space.
So it's like creating a frame for that icon.
Yeah.
Which allows it to breathe a bit.
Exactly. And on the other end of the spectrum, be careful about scaling screenshots down too aggressively.
Oh yeah, I've definitely seen screenshots where the text is so tiny that it's practically unreadable.
Right. If you need to include a detailed screenshot in a small space,
Yeah.
consider taking the screenshot at a smaller screen size.
Okay.
Or capturing only a portion of the UI.
So it's about choosing the right level of fidelity for the context.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you could also create a simplified schematic version of the screenshot.
Okay.
Focus on the key layout elements without trying to reproduce every tiny detail.
It's like creating a more abstract representation of the UI,
Yeah.
which might be more appropriate in certain contexts. Yeah.
Exactly. And speaking of context, don't forget about user-generated content.
Oh yeah.
When you're working with images that you don't have direct control over,
Hmm.
you need to take extra precautions.
Yeah, that's where things can get really unpredictable. You never know what people are gonna upload.
It's like opening Pandora's box.
Aha. Yes.
One way to maintain some control is to control the shape and size of user uploaded images
Okay.
instead of instead of displaying them at their native aspect ratio, which can create inconsistent layouts.
Right.
Set of them within fixed containers and crop any overflow.
So you're basically creating a template that those images have to conform to.
Exactly. And to prevent images with similar background colors from blending into your UI,
Right.
try adding a subtle inner box shadow.
Oh, I like that.
It creates that visual separation without relying on a border, which might clash with the image's colors.
Right, right. It's like giving those images a little bit of breathing room too.
Well,
Breathing room for everyone. Okay, I'm feeling much more confident about working with images now. But before we wrap up, I want to talk about those those little finishing touches
oh yeah.
that can really elevate a design from good to great.
Oh yeah. The details, they can make all the difference.
Yeah.
And the authors had this great concept called supercharging the defaults.
Supercharging the defaults. That sounds intriguing.
It's about taking those everyday elements,
Okay.
like bulleted lists
Yeah.
or testimonials, and giving them a little, extra visual flair.
So it's like taking those basic building blocks and customizing them to fit your brand's personality.
Exactly. For example, try replacing the standard bullet points in a list with icons.
Okay.
It adds visual interest and can also help to reinforce the content.
Ooh, I like that idea. It's like making those lists feel more dynamic and engaging.
Right. And for testimonials, consider styling the quotes as prominent design elements. Use a larger font size, a different color, maybe even a unique font.
So you're really drawing attention to those words of praise.
Exactly. And don't forget about links. Experiment with custom underlines or subtle color shifts on hover.
It's all about those little details that make a big difference in terms of user experience.
Exactly. Even something as simple as using custom checkboxes and radio buttons
Right.
can inject a touch of personality into your UI.
It's like you're saying we care about every detail, even the tiny ones.
Exactly. And another simple but effective technique is to add color with accent borders.
Accent borders. Okay, tell me more.
It could be as subtle as a thin line along the top of a card,
Okay.
or as bold as like a band of color across the entire header.
So it's like using color to create subtle visual cues.
Exactly. You can use accent borders to highlight active navigation items,
Okay.
draw attention to alerts,
Huh.
or just add a pop of color to an otherwise plain element.
I'm starting to feel like a kid in a candy store with all these design techniques.
I know it's so much fun to play around with these different techniques and see what you can create. And speaking of playing around, don't be afraid to decorate your backgrounds.
Wait, decorate like with wallpaper?
Not quite,
Yeah.
but even a well-structured UI can sometimes feel a bit monotonous.
Okay.
So consider adding some subtle embellishments to your backgrounds.
Okay. I'm listening. What kind of embellishments are we talking about?
You could try using a slightly different background color for specific sections or panels,
Okay.
or experiment with gradients.
Sure.
Subtle repeating patterns can add a touch of texture and visual interest.
Right.
And if you're feeling really adventurous, try incorporating simple geometric shapes or illustrations into your backgrounds.
Wow, so many possibilities. But how do you make sure that those background decorations don't interfere with the readability of the content?
The key is to keep the contrast low. Those background elements should be subtle and unobtrusive. They should enhance the the design, not distract from it. Now let's talk about something that's often overlooked but super important: empty states.
Empty states. You mean those blank screens that people see when there's no data to display?
Exactly. But instead of treating them as an afterthought, think of them as an opportunity.
For what?
An opportunity to engage the user, use imagery, clear calls to action, and a simplified UI to make empty states feel welcoming and encouraging.
So it's like you're turning those empty states into a positive experience.
Exactly. Remember that that empty state might be the user's first impression of a particular feature.
Right.
So you want to make it count. Now, let's talk about something that we often overuse: borders.
Borders. Are you saying we should get rid of all borders?
Not necessarily. Borders can be effective for creating separation.
Yeah.
But relying on them too heavily can make your UI feel cluttered and heavy.
Yeah, I've definitely seen designs where it feels like everything has a border and it's just too much.
Right. So consider using alternative techniques to achieve that same separation.
Okay.
Box shadows can create a subtle outline without the visual weight of a border.
Right.
Varying background colors can also distinguish adjacent elements.
Okay.
And sometimes simply adding extra spacing is enough.
So it's about finding more elegant and subtle ways to create visual separation.
Exactly. And finally, let's talk about thinking outside the box.
Oh, I love that phrase. It's so inspiring.
We tend to get stuck in those preconceived notions about how certain UI elements should look.
Yeah.
But those assumptions can limit our creativity.
Yeah, it's like we get so used to seeing things a certain way that we forget that there might be other better ways to do them.
Exactly. So challenge those conventions. Experiment with unconventional layouts and interactions. Reimagine drop downs, tables, radio buttons, anything that feels stale or predictable.
It's like we're given permission to break the rules and create something truly unique.
Exactly.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening deep dive. Refactoring UI really, challenges those ingrained design habits and encourages you to think more critically about every decision.
It's not just about making things look pretty. It's about understanding the why behind those design choices,
Right.
and creating interfaces that are both beautiful and functional.
I feel like I have a whole new set of tools and techniques to play with now. But as you said earlier, design is an ongoing journey. So, what are some resources or tips for continuing that learning process?
Well, first and foremost, I'd highly recommend checking out the full Refactoring UI book.
Okay.
This deep dive was just a taste of all the amazing insights they have to offer.
Yeah, this was like a delicious appetizer, but I'm ready for the main course now.
Exactly. And beyond that,
Yeah.
there are tons of great resources out there: blogs, podcasts, online courses. Stay curious and keep experimenting.
It's like we've been given a key to unlock a whole new world of design possibilities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And don't underestimate the power of observation.
Oh.
Pay attention to the the UIs you interact with every day. What works well, what could be improved.
It's like becoming a design detective, always looking for clues and inspiration.
Exactly. And remember, design is a collaborative process. Don't be afraid to share your ideas, get feedback, and learn from others.
It's like we're all on this design journey together, constantly learning and evolving.
Well said. I think that's a great note to end on.
Yeah, let's leave our listener with that sense of excitement and possibility. So, to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into refactoring UI. Now go forth and create amazing user interfaces.
Happy designing.